Hey, I'm Dan Fitzpatrick at stockmarketmentor.com. And today, guess what? I want to talk to you about SpaceX because what's happening right now is actually pretty cool. I think we got a lot of opportunities for good trades here. One thing I did today at Option Market Mentor was put on a bull call spread. That's a debit spread. It was a 160, 180, where I buy the 160 calls and then I sell the 180 calls basically to finance the 160 calls. So if you don't understand how bull call spreads work, then you probably shouldn't be trading options because that's a really, really cool way to be making money. A lot of people, a lot of kind of new option traders, all they want to do is just buy calls. And those new option traders that just want to buy calls, the problem is that they're never going to be in the game long enough to become old option traders because it's a horrible way to create a strategy that's actually going to make you money in the long run. So definitely a bull call debit spread works the best, but that's for another day. That's for my option traders. So what I want to do now is look at the chart of SpaceX and talk about a couple things. First of all, the NASDAQ inclusion, which is coming up pretty soon, and then also lockup and what's the issue with that. And then I guess the third thing is what's the price doing? Okay, so I'll get right to it here. Okay, move this out of the way. So we've got SpaceX here. Remember, 150 was the price that the company got when the shares were released. Nobody else got that. Everybody's paying. I think it opened at like 160, 160 or 163, something like that. But the bottom line is, for all intents and purposes, people look at 150 as par. In other words, 150 is where the stock opened for trading. That's going to be typically what's just viewed as the IPO. As the IPO price that everything else is based on. So, what's happening here is over the last couple trading days, this thing's gone up almost 10%. At one point, it was 10%. And it's always, you can see like a really, really solid support here right at $150. By the way, speaking of the bull call spread that I just noted, like the 160, 180 bull call spread, 166.50 is my break even point. So as long as the stock gets to 166.50, hopefully above that, I've got a trade that's going to make money. And that's a pretty cool thing because things already up at 163, almost 164. So, but the thing I want to talk about today is, first of all, the NASDAQ inclusion. There's the stock's going to be added to the NASDAQ 100, and it will actually be added on Friday. Or it was, first of all, it was announced that it would be added last Friday on the 26th. On Monday, the 6th, that's a week from today, that's going to be the last trading day before inclusion into the NASDAQ. And so this is when the index funds, arbitrage desks are going to be completing their buying for their portfolios. Excuse me. They're not going to be doing it on the following day. They're going to be doing it on the last trading day. So they're all the way in. And so you're probably going to see some additional buying over the next week as funds and arbitrageurs work to get more SpaceX in. Look, this company is, if you're just doing a traditional valuation of this based on earnings and based on revenue, I mean, this stock is pornographically high. There's no way that the current fundamentals would justify this stock price. But we're not talking about the typical fundamentals. We're talking about SpaceX and all the things that are attendant to that, Elon Musk, space, all that other stuff. So hopefully this thing goes to about 1,000 because I bought a bunch for my stepkids. None for me. I've been selling puts on it and buying this covered call or this call strategy. But I like the idea that this can be running up into the end of this week, just because, like literally just because of the addition. There's no other reason for this to happen. And so on so it becomes on Monday is the last trading day. So Tuesday before the open, that's when it becomes a member of the NASDAQ 100. I think, again, we want to be into this stock now. Don't be looking for Tuesday when this is included to be like, oh, well, now there's a bunch of buying that's going to take place because it's in the NASDAQ 100. Guys, that train has already left the station. So we want to get on the train while it's still in the station. Now, with respect to other things, the lockup, everybody's concerned about the lockup. All these lockups are going to push this stock down. Okay, let's talk about this for a minute. I'm looking at my research over here. I'm not going to show it to you because it's really sloppy. But in late July and early August, we've got the Q2 earnings release. That's late July, early August. Remember, this is late June. 20% of eligible insider shares unlock. So if SPX is traded at least 30% above its 135 IPO price, another 10% can accelerate. I don't need to read. Then, 70 days later, there's another 7%. And then in September, another 7%, blah, blah, blah. So the bottom line is this is a staggered lockup expiration. And what that means for you and me is it's not like we're going to wake up one day and see the stock down 12% and we're wondering why. And it turns out that all the insiders dumped their stock. They bought it early on at $70 and now they don't give a damn what price they sell it at. They just want to get out. We're not going to have to deal with that. And so my suggestion, the way I'm playing this is to be like I trade the 60-minute charts a lot on this. And you can see this is a really, really good example of finding a bottom over a number of days. Like you look at this looks pretty choppy. Kind of could go up, could go down, but you zoom in to an hour long and you can see this little volatility squeeze. So as I'm looking at this stock, I think my 166.50 is pretty much a lock. What I'm looking for is above 180, because if this is above 180, I make better than 3-to-1 on my risk versus reward, which is all I really care about in option trading. So anyway, I hope this helps. I hope this works for you. One thing I want to invite you to do is join my team at stockmarketmentor.com. I just explained an option trade to you, but I'm teaching stocks and options over there. I would read you some positive feedback and all that, but here's the question. Have you ever heard anybody in my position read you negative shit? Somebody goes, oh, well, here's some stuff from people that lost money or didn't like me or whatever. So everybody can give you positive feedback. It's almost worthless. What's not worthless is you joining for $7. $7, you get a 2-day look-see. My bet is you invest $7. Look, it's the best trade you're going to make. $7 for 14 days. My bet is after 14 days, you're going to say, wow, I think I'll stick around. At least that's what everybody else is doing. All right. So that's all I got for you. I'll see you next time.